Why was the experience of revolution so different in the cities of Paris, London, and New York in the late 1700s? Historian Mike Rapport will be here to talk about his new book, The Unruly City.
The British radicals themselves, the people pressing for democratic reform, they themselves were adamant that they didn't want to achieve their ends by force.
How has man-made intervention transformed the Great Lakes? Author Dan Egan will be here to discuss his important new book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes.
The pace of the change has been extraordinary, and it's come with a lot of pain.
Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Mike Rapport joins us now. His new book is called The Unruly City, Paris, London, and New York in the Age of Revolution. Mike, thank you for being here.
Very welcome. It's good to be here.
So you are professor of modern European history at the University of Glasgow in Scotland and author previously of several books, but 1848 Year of Revolution is probably the most well-known of them. What interested you in this subject?
Well, first of all, I love walking around. I like hill walking in the Scottish Highlands primarily, but I also really enjoy walking in cities. You see things which you might not see from public transport. And what that does is it kind of sparks my curiosity about how the cities were laid out, why are they laid out in the way they are, what is the history behind some of these buildings. The second impulse is that I'm an enthusiast of the French Revolution. It's been a topic I've really been immersed in since I was at university. At the same time, my parents moved to Paris. And so what happened is I found that Paris, aligned with the period in which I was most interested, the French Revolution. And I started wandering around the city, wondering, what was it like back in 1789? What was it like back in 1790? So I developed a bit of a hobby of trying to track down the spaces and places where the revolutionary events took place in the 1790s. So when I floated this idea to my publisher in London, my editor, Little Brown, was Tim Whiting, I talked about writing about revolutionary Paris. We discussed the topic more broadly, and we thought actually giving it an Atlantic dimension would be very good fun, very interesting, and give it a kind of global or wider international resonance. So London seemed to be an obvious choice because of our interest and our love of A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens. But equally, New York, because I know the city the best, probably of all the American cities. I myself have a background from New York City, or at least a little bit outside in Bronxville, New York, is where I was born. And I've lived and worked there for a while. And I was also fascinated in terms of New York by the really fluctuating fortunes of the city, from revolution to war to British military occupation, to including the Great Fire of 1776, the Reconstruction after the Revolution, and how it becomes briefly the capital of the young United States, and finally culminating in the great political debates about the future of the Republic and the influence of the French Revolution. So I really enjoyed the challenge about how all this bound together, how you can narrate the fortunes of three separate cities, London, Paris, and New York in the Age of Revolution.
Let's start with New York. Many Americans don't, even though it clearly was a big part of the revolution, they think of when they think of the American Revolution, Boston and the Boston Tea Party. First, let's start with what did New York look like at that time, and how central was it to the outbreak of the American Revolution?
Well, first of all, what it looked like, it was very, very small, diminutive. I mean, initially, when I thought about this subject, I thought, how do I compare the three cities? I mean, Paris, a city of 600,000 in 1789, London, a city topping 1 million by 1800. New York, you're looking at anywhere between 30,000 and 45,000 people. So it's much, much smaller than these greater metropolises on the other side of the Atlantic.
And geographically, it was really just the southern tip of Manhattan at that point.
Absolutely. It reached up to roughly where City Hall Park is now. That was the Common. That was well, it was called the Fields by New Yorkers in the 18th century. You're getting very much close to the northernmost limits of the built-up area of the city. It's a colonial city, of course, in a legal sense, prior to the Revolution. But when you read about it, you can feel it shaking off that sense that it's a colonial city. It's very cosmopolitan. The most striking thing you would have seen when you arrived into New York Bay on board a wooden ship would have been spires, loads and loads of church spires. They were the tallest structures in New York City in those days.
And what made New York ripe for revolutionary fervor?
Well, there was, first of all, it was of immense strategic importance to the British and therefore to the Americans once the war broke out. So the British did have a garrison presence there. First of all, at Fort George on the southern tip of Manhattan, close to the Battery. And then what in those days would have been uptown at where City Hall Park now is, roughly along the line of modern-day Chambers Street, which is where there was a big barracks as well. And traditionally it was the headquarters of the British military forces for all of North America was going to be New York City because of its location. From the Patriot point of view, there was an interesting mix of people. First of all, New York as an urban center was absolutely awash with print culture. There's newspapers, the availability of print, like many urban centers in the 18th century, has a highly literate population. People are debating new ideas, not just political ones, but often religious ones as well. So there is a kind of a cultural environment which allows people to kind of talk, discuss, and to read a lot of new ideas. The second thing about the people of New York is that they're mixed socially. One of the most important aspects of this is the harbor area on the East River. The docklands had a lot of coming and going, a lot of people toing and froing, and that meant that you also had a lot of influx of sailors. What you find pops up in the reports of kind of crowd action, of riots and so on, especially once the resistance to imperial authority begins, it is always sailors present. Now, they seem to be pretty radical, partly because their own world on board has got a rather kind of rough and ready egalitarianism. Also, there's a very important legal establishment. It's a center of kind of law, of course, in the New York colony, and some important patrician families, the Delanceys and the Livingstons, who really kind of dominate colonial politics, but who have a rivalry. And the Delanceys, in the end, swung behind the crown, swung behind the loyalty to the British. The Livingstons ended up siding very early on, actually, with the Patriots. So there's a leadership there, too. And in between, you had all these middle-ranking people who could bridge the gap between the political elites, colonial elites, who kind of led the resistance, and the working people of New York City, who provided, if you like, the muscle, the backbone of the revolution.
So New York becomes a central part of the American Revolution, as well as Paris. And I want to go back to Paris, but there is no revolution in London. Why does the revolution not take hold in London?
One of the reasons it avoids revolution is partly because, as I argue in the book, the British radicals themselves, the people pressing for democratic reform, by which in those days they meant universal male suffrage, very few people spoke about enfranchising women, they themselves were adamant that they didn't want to achieve their ends by force. They were adamant that they wanted to use legal means. And they were partly driven by a strong belief in the wider virtues of the British Constitution. They didn't want to overthrow the monarchy. They didn't even want to overthrow the aristocracy, whose power was represented in the House of Lords. They said they simply wanted a democratic reform of the lower house, the House of Commons. Now, in pushing for this, they used the press, they used public meetings, and they also used, and this is what I argue in the book, is they also used the traditional venues where working people gathered. And these were London taverns. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is that when the backlash does come in 1793, 1794, when the British authorities are very alarmed by what they see as the infection of principles coming over from the French Revolution, what happened was the magistrates who gave licenses to taverns could put the tavern keepers under a great deal of pressure and say, if you allow these radicals to meet in your taverns, no matter how respectable they claim to be, then we'll withdraw your license. And so slowly but surely, the radicals get squeezed out of the habitual venues where they can really connect with their artisanal base, their, if you like, their working class base.
Let's turn to Paris, because that's the city I think we most closely associate with revolution during this period, and the most violent of all, especially when you get to the Reign of Terror. What was it about Paris that contributed to or allowed for this level of violence? Did it have to do with the geography, with the population, the economy at that time?
Some historians argue that the violence is kind of scripted within revolutionary ideology. That what you get is, once you argue that the people are absolutely sovereign, the people cannot really do any wrong because they are the sovereign, so therefore anything they do is legitimate, then what do you do with opposition? If you have opposition, then opposition itself can be defined as against the people, against the sovereign people, and in extremis, like a war, which is what was happening in France from 1792, they can be killed. That's one argument. But the other argument is that the circumstances were so intense. You mentioned the economy. There is an economic meltdown. There is inflation of the revolutionary paper money, which is absolutely catastrophic in 1793. France in 1793 is invaded on absolutely every single frontier. It's at war with every major Western European power, including the British, by 1793. You have counter-revolution in the West, because with the overthrow of the monarchy previously in 1792, you have a lot of people who don't like that, a lot of royalist peasants out there who don't like the overthrow of the monarchy, didn't like the reforms the revolution imposed on the Catholic Church, and above all, didn't want to be conscripted to fight for the armies of the French Republic. And then to boot, you have fratricidal struggle within the revolution itself in 1793. 1793 is a critical year for the onset of terror. And that is between relatively quite hardcore Republicans called Jacobins and relatively moderate revolutionaries called Girondins. That fratricide turns into civil war in the provinces because the Jacobins' power base is Paris. That's where they get elected to the National Convention, the parliament at the time, the legislature. Whereas the Girondins are provincial, their power bases in the provinces. So you get a civil war really between the interests of the provinces against Paris.
I want to bring us back to New York and also to, as you said earlier, walking through the cities and a love for walking towards the city. For New Yorkers or for visitors to New York, where would you send people to get a glimpse of Revolutionary era New York in Manhattan today?
Okay. The two places which immediately spring to mind, the Bowling Green, which is where they toppled the statue of King George III in 1776. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I'm not sure if this is actually bona fide, but one of the other things they did was they filed off the crowns on top of the railings around the statue, around the green. And you can still see some of these. You still see the rough edge. Now, I'm not sure if they've been kind of kept from all that time ago, or whether they've been kind of replaced as part of a long-term tradition, if you know what I mean. So that's one place you could go to. The other place is City Hall Park, because that was the site of the Common. And there are plaques all over the place about where things happen, where the Liberty Pole, which is so controversial, I talk about that a lot in the book, where the Liberty Pole was sited because British troops kept trying to knock it down, and they often succeeded. Patriots kept putting it back up, and the Liberty Pole became ever more spectacular with each successive version. There's a plaque where the Declaration of Independence was read out by officers to George Washington's troops assembled on the Common, or rather nowadays in City Hall Park. Also, have a look in St. Paul's Church on Broadway. St. Paul's Church was important because it was one of the places where lots of loyalists worshipped, because it was Episcopalian, it was Anglican rather, and it was also in an area called the Holy Ground. And the Holy Ground was rather ironically named because it was the big red light district. That was also very nearby where Columbia University was. And this was often a site of conflict as well between British troops and patriots, lots of taverns and things like that in that area. Also, it might be worth looking at Federal Hall. Federal Hall has been rebuilt, but Federal Hall, the site, it's got some great displays there as well, and that's worth a visit too.
All right. Well, that's for listeners interested in revisiting the dawn of democracy. Mike Rapport, thank you so much again for being here.
You're very welcome. It's been a real pleasure.
The book, again, is The Unruly City, Paris, London, and New York in the Age of Revolution. Dan Egan joins us now from Milwaukee. His new book is called The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. Dan, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so there's an obvious inversion here in the title. Why the death and life of the Great Lakes rather than vice versa?
Well, we didn't really want to imply that the lakes are dead, and I think the title, first of all, it's kind of a nod to the death and life of the great American cities, and, New York certainly isn't dead today. And neither are the Great Lakes, but they have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, and they really, in a lot of ways, don't resemble their former selves. So, in a way, the old lakes did die, but they're still going strong in different ways today.
Let's start with the kind of the pristine state of the Great Lakes. They're 20% of the world's fresh water. What did they look like before we started interfering with them?
Well, what's really interesting is just the size of the lakes. They span 94,000 square miles, which is roughly the size of the United Kingdom. But despite that vastness, in a lot of ways, they were as biologically isolated as a pond in Wisconsin's North Woods. And that's because they didn't have any interaction with the outside aquatic world, due largely to Niagara Falls protecting Lakes Erie, Superior, Michigan, and Huron, and then the St. Lawrence River below Lake Ontario, which was a roaring, tumbling river up which basically nothing could swim. And on the western side, there was something they called a subcontinental divide. I like to think of it as a continental divide, and it was a berm in the landscape, not nearly as impressive as the Rocky Mountains, but just as important because it kept waters of the Mississippi River Basin from mixing with waters of the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes are relatively young. They're really babies, ecologically speaking. They're about 10,000 years old. And they were populated with a relatively simple assemblage of fish until we started punching shipping channels to the west and to the east and opened them up to all manner of biological mischief.
All right, before we get into the mischief, what was the fish life like in the Great Lakes?
So at the top of this relatively simple food chain, you had lake trout, and they were basically the wolf in the system, and they feasted on an array of smaller forage fish, many of which there were 7 or 8 species, and they were very similar to whitefish, and they're basically gone now. But you had some minor players biologically. You had sturgeon on the fringes, and you had perch and walleye. But it was pretty much a lake trout show, and they feasted on this group of fish that were very similar to whitefish.
So when did the problems with the Great Lakes begin? It's a relatively new situation.
Yeah, there's really, in my mind, there's 2 waves of invasions, and the first wave came in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and that was sea lampreys, which swam up the shipping channels, which are today known as the St. Lawrence Seaway. They were kind of precursors to the Seaway, which opened in the late 1950s. The sea lamprey is a fish. It looks like an eel, and they're parasitic, and they attach to their prey's bellies and literally suck the life out of them, the blood and the other juices. And they came in, and in a very short time, knocked out the lake trout. And the lake trout were the governor on the system. They basically controlled the flow of energy, and with this apex predator gone, it opened the door for an explosion in smaller fish. And unfortunately for the Great Lakes, right behind the sea lampreys came alewives, which is a type of herring. They both swam up from the East Coast. They're both anadromous, which means they can live in salt and fresh water, depending on where they are in their life cycle. And the alewives exploded to the point where in the 1960s, the biomass in Lake Michigan was estimated to be 90% alewife. So for every 10 pounds of fish you had swimming in the lakes, 9 of it was alewives. And while they could thrive in the lakes, and reproduce very well. They weren't really good at living in the lakes, and that's because they were constantly under stress due to the fact that they are a true saltwater species, and they couldn't survive temperature swings that are so common in the lakes. So you would have these alewife die-offs by the billions, and they were wreaking havoc on beaches from, Cleveland to Chicago. It was a mess.
But these new species didn't just swim in suddenly without cause. I mean, there were engineering changes that took place that allowed for the introduction of these new species. What happened?
Well, the first thing that happened was the Erie Canal, which opened in the 1820s, and that created a navigational corridor between Lake Erie and New York Harbor via the Hudson River and then the Erie Canal. It also opened the door for species to migrate into the lakes. And not far behind the Erie Canal came the Welland Canal, which connected Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. It's basically a hydraulic lift system to bring boats around Niagara Falls, and species were able to make their way into the lakes that way as well.
These were considered engineering marvels at the time. Were they aware that these constructions would alter the ecology of the lakes?
No, nobody was thinking in these terms. And, the lamprey showed just how devastating these invasive species can be. I think invasive species doesn't really do justice to what these outside organisms have done to the lakes. It really is a form of biological pollution. But back when they were, trying to open up the middle of the continent, nobody was worried about that. And they weren't worried about it in the 1950s when they opened up the St. Lawrence Seaway either.
And so if these new species come in and they wipe out the top of the food chain, how does that impact the rest of the ecosystem? And why is it a bad thing? And is it always a bad thing?
Well, badness is in the eye of the beholder, but I think it was undeniably bad in the 1960s when the lakes were retching ashore billions of alewives to the point where, they were lighting them on fire on beaches in Chicago. They were using bulldozers. They were actually dumping some sort of perfume just so people in places like Evanston wouldn't gag when they got near the beach. So the lakes really were broken, and they needed a new predator, or they needed a predator to take them out. And biologists in the 1950s and 60s knocked down the lampreys, which opened the door for the restoration of a predator to bring some balance back to the lake. And the natural choice would have been lake trout, remnant populations of which still hung on in Lake Superior and some other corners of the Great Lakes. But instead, some fishery managers in Michigan had a better idea. They wanted to bring in a sexier predator, so they brought in Pacific salmon. And so it brought some balance back to the lakes, and it created a remarkable recreational fishery, but it was heavily, heavily managed. And now that salmon fishery in the Great Lakes appears to be getting wobbly, just as the lake trout population did a half century ago.
What's happening to those salmon?
When the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up in 1959, that opened the door for these big ocean-going freighters to come up from the Atlantic from any port anywhere in the world. And they brought with them not only, the cargo listed in their manifests, they brought in all sorts of unwanted biological pollution, foreign organisms that hitchhiked their way in the ship's ballast tanks, which are used to balance an uneven ship on the open seas. And so these boats started bringing in exotic species from all over the globe, and none have been more devastating than quagga and zebra mussels, which have just ravaged plankton populations. So really, they hit the food chain or the food web at its most vulnerable point at the bottom, and everything above is suffering.
Is that the biggest threat to the Great Lakes now? Is it a potential outside invasive species? And is there one in particular that is sort of the great fear?
Well, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the lakes were protected on the east by Niagara Falls and on the west by the subcontinental divide. Well, that subcontinental divide was basically destroyed when Chicago replumbed its namesake river, so it flowed out of Lake Michigan and into the Mississippi River Basin instead of into Lake Michigan. And now migrating up this artificial connection between these two massive basins are the dreaded Asian carp, two species of which are not far from Lake Michigan today, and they're held back only by an electric barrier on the canal that pulled the river backwards, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. I mentioned earlier the zebra and quagga mussels and how they've really literally decimated plankton populations in the lakes. These carp feed on the same plankton. So maybe the mussels beat them to the punch in terms of the open waters in the lakes. But most people believe they do really well in the rivers and bays and harbors of the Great Lakes, which happen to be where most people recreate. And I don't know if you know anything about these Asian carp, but they can grow to 100 pounds, and they also leap out of the water like missiles when they're agitated by the whir of a boat motor. So in areas where they've already infested rivers and lakes in the Mississippi River Basin, recreational boating's become all but impossible. I mean, the researchers who go out and study them wear hockey helmets when they're on their boat.
Wow.
And they're not doing it for fun.
What should be done now that's not happening?
So the boats bringing in this trouble, that have historically brought in this trouble, are the overseas boats, and those actually account for a very small fraction of shipping on the Great Lakes and shipping up the St. Lawrence Seaway, which is the system of locks and canals that allows these big boats to sail between the Atlantic coast and the Great Lakes. They account for less than 5% of the overall traffic. And some people have said, we should shut the Seaway down, and I don't think that's ever been thought of as a real serious consideration. But other people have said, maybe we shouldn't let these overseas ships in. And I wouldn't advocate for that at this point, but I would advocate, and I do in the book, for a detailed cost-benefit analysis to see what is the value of these goods coming in, because it's not high-value finished goods. It's typically foreign steel coming in, and the boats leave with Midwest grain. And on average, fewer than 2 boats arrive a day into the system now, and that system is only open 9 months of the year because of ice. And some people have pushed numbers around, and there is capacity on the train tracks, and if they were to require that cargo to be offloaded and brought in by some other means, say by train or truck or barge coming up the Mississippi, the first look at what the cost would be is $55 million. Now you compare that to the billions of dollars that these exotic mussels have done to the Great Lakes. And not just the Great Lakes, they ride the canal water out of Chicago and into the middle of the continent, and now they're a scourge all across North America. And they all came through the same exquisitely tight pinch point on the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's an 80-foot wide lock, and every time the doors open to that lock, it opens up the potential for a continental problem. And I do think that, if we just give the lakes a break and stop these invasions from coming, I think they'll find a new balance.
All right. Well, some optimism then there for the Great Lakes. Dan, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot for your time.
The book again is The Death and Life of the Great Lakes by Dan Egan.
This is John Williams. I'm joined by my colleague, Alexandra Alter, to talk about literary news. Hey, Alexandra.
Hey, John.
So what's going on this week?
So this week, Amazon opened its first physical bookstore in Manhattan. This is its 7th store overall, and it's kind of an interesting location. It's in the middle of Midtown, which is, of course, the heart of the publishing industry. It's a few blocks away from Penguin Random House and near Simon & Schuster and Hachette. And it's interesting. I mean,
it's in the building that there was a Borders in.
That's
it's not
also,
in that space, is it?
Yes, it's not in the exact same space as the Borders, but it's in the same building. So there's deep symbolic resonance. It's sort of the evolution of Amazon as an invasive species, if you will. It's often blamed for putting physical bookstores out of business. It definitely contributed to the demise of Borders. It's certainly wounded Barnes & Noble and some independents. And so, people were really surprised when Amazon committed to opening their own physical bookstores. Why would an online company that's been so successful kind of with their digital business and their virtual business commit to the brick and mortar business, which seems so old-fashioned. But it's interesting when you go into the store, and this is the first time I've had the chance to visit an Amazon store, it's very different from a traditional bookstore. I mean, you walk in and, of course, there's books everywhere. But when you look at the selections and the way the sections are sort of laid out, it's not traditional. It's really drawing on their vast online customer base. The first thing you see when you walk in is a table that says highly rated. These are books that have gotten 4.8 stars or higher. Another table has books that are quickly read by Kindle users, which, people finished in 3 days or less. So
do they have things like the Kindle prominently displayed too?
They do. There's
technology?
right when you walk into the Columbus Circle store, just to the right, there's a pretty large area devoted to all their devices. You can kind of play around with an Echo or an Alexa, which are their voice-activated digital assistants.
Right.
There's a bunch of Kindles and Fires and various things displayed. And I think Amazon is pretty open about the fact that that was a big part of their decision to open physical bookstores, was a way to get people to kind of interact with their devices.
Their gadgets.
Exactly.
And the books are also, I assume they're organized by category at some point. Like
they are, yes.
But then how
Absolutely.
they're displayed in an odd way.
Yes, they have traditional categories, fiction, nonfiction, business, travel, and all that stuff. They're displayed, all of them face out, which means, they have many fewer titles than a traditional bookstore. I think this store is 4,000 square feet and it has 3,000 titles. Whereas, I was recently at Emma Straub's new store in Brooklyn called Books Are Magic, and she has, I think, close to 10,000 titles. And the space is not dissimilar. It's a similar size, but what they give up in kind of selection, they make up for, they say, in curation.
Well, and everybody looks for the face-out books. That's the joke is authors go in and, turn their books face out on the shelves.
Of course, it jumps out at you. It is really inviting when you see them displayed that way. As one of the Amazon executives who was there kind of guiding the press through the store this week said, this bookstore is all about discovery, which you hear a lot of, independents say as well. Mm-hmm. And she said, if you already know what you're going to buy it online anyway.
Well, that's what everyone says, that, people like me who love to browse in bookstores say that they miss that experience on places like Amazon. But you said this is the 7th store. Do these stores do well?
That is a great question. They're very secretive, I would say, about their sales and information. Because it's such a large company, they could lose money on their physical spaces and still see some advantage. One thing I think the stores are designed to do is encourage you to sign up for Prime. Because if you're a Prime member, you get the Amazon discount price. If you're not, you pay the list price on the book. And studies have shown that once you sign up for Prime, you spend a lot more on Amazon. As you can imagine, it's just that convenient. So in a way, walking into the store was a little disorienting. It felt kind of like a 3D version of being on Amazon's website. You were just confronted with all these reminders. Even the review cards below the books had regular people's Amazon reviews. It wasn't, so-and-so bookseller recommends.
It's just like the world's largest staff picks. It's just that everyone is their staff, like all the readers who write on their website.
And, they're scheduled to open another store in Manhattan on 34th Street later this summer. And overall this year, they're opening 6 more stores, I believe. So,
wow. And we should mention to listeners and readers that you talked about briefly Emma Straub's bookstore. And you have a piece in the paper this week about that store and about some other bookstores run by prominent authors and what they're recommending people read this summer. So they can look online and find that.
Yes. It was fun to talk to booksellers who are also novelists, because booksellers, like novelists, get all these advanced copies and they're kind of voracious readers. And so I asked a few novelists who also have bookstores what they're recommending to customers. So you can see what Emma Straub is recommending, Jonathan Lethem, Ann Patchett, Jeff Kinney, Judy Blume, and Louise Erdrich.
All right, some prominent picks.
Yes.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
I am joined by my colleagues Greg Coles and Parl Sagal to talk about what we're reading this week. Hey, guys.
Hi, John.
We're without our fearless leader, Pamela Paul, who is on a working vacation in Australia this week, talking to various authors at festivals and other literary events. And Greg, let's start with you, because Parl and I actually have a sort of mini book club going this week.
Book club.
And we apologize for not including you. Yeah, but
That's
we'll
okay. I'm used to it. Actually, you and I can have a mini book club ourselves, because the book that I'm reading is one that I know you read earlier this year because you mentioned it on the podcast. I'm reading Rachel Cusk's novel Transit, which is just kind of an extension, a sequel to her novel Outline.
Which was one of our 10 best a couple of years ago.
It was. I loved Outline, and I'm loving Transit even more.
So do I. I think it's better.
There are novels that I admire but don't love, and novels that I love but don't admire. And this is both Outline and Transit are books that I admire and love. So they're kind of right in that rare
yes, I agree with that
combination.
completely.
I admire it because it takes kind of so many risks structurally. You have to set aside any notion of plot and any notion of traditional narrator and just embrace a sensibility instead. The voice, it's a first-person narrator, but as in Outline, she kind of shuts off any access to her own life to focus instead on the people that she encounters throughout. But of course, you get her total sensibility throughout, and it's curious and game, receptive, kind
it's
of
very funny
delighted.
sometimes.
Yeah, it's very funny in a very British kind of droll way.
Why do you think this one is better than the first one?
I'm curious about that too, because you said
I
that to
agree
me
with
the
you,
other day,
yeah.
and I'm surprised that Parla agrees so readily, because I had a hard time not distinguishing between them, but I felt like my reaction to them was pretty similar.
Maybe it's because I'm used to what she's doing now. So I had a longer adjustment period in the first one where now I could just sink right into it. There's something that feels warmer about this book to me.
We get more of her. And we actually do get more about her life and her friends and a little bit more about her
she's
children,
renovating the
her
house.
house.
Yeah, it's clear.
And it feels less self-conscious, I think.
Even
the
though
art
she
of it is.
still deflects, it's much more immersed in her daily life.
We see her
and the
dating.
things.
Yeah, we see all sorts of
Yeah, exactly. There's something almost short story-ish about it, too.
Little
Each
episodes.
chapter, exactly. It's very kind of anecdotal or episodic.
More so than the first book. I think maybe hearing you guys talk about it, I think I maybe preferred the first book a little bit because it felt a little fresher because I didn't know what she was doing yet, and because the sort of slipstream of it was a bit more interesting to me than the more structured variety this time around.
Yeah.
But they're both great, and there's a third one coming.
That's what I
some
hear.
point.
So she's kind of doing the whole Knausgaard or Ferrante thing. And there's a very funny sort of mock Knausgaard
Not sort
element.
of, absolutely, pointedly.
Pointedly,
Knausgaard
although
critique.
she makes him gay.
Yeah.
And so that part is different.
Yeah, no, she could write 40 of these for all I care. And,
And I think so. John and I are going to talk about. She's like the antithesis.
I'm going to make
of
a
Rachel
very
Cusk.
brief detour because I normally don't read very far ahead in this job, even though we get advanced galleys of everything. And I know we don't like to step on our reviews, but I feel like this is far enough in the future that I just want to briefly note that Roddy Doyle, who's a writer I admire a great deal, has a new novel coming out in October called Smile, and I've been reading that. And so I won't say too much about it, but I do think that it's very good among his canon. So Parl and I I'm sort of forcing you to reread a book that I'm reading for the first time, which is Chris Krause's novel, I Love Dick, which I was sort of prompted to read, been meaning to for a long time, but there is this Jill Soloway TV show now based on the novel. And maybe you could quickly summarize what it is exactly, because I'm only about 50 pages in still.
Sure. I mean, the premise is it's, again, to go on the whole Knausgaard. Like, I think she was not one of the first, but one of the first sort of to get a lot of credit.
She was early
She was
on
early,
this
right?
trend.
To sort of like do something that was kind of semi-autobiographical. It's a story of Chris, who's a filmmaker, as she was, and her husband still there. And Chris develops this infatuation with this guy named Dick, who's based on the cultural theorist Dick Hebdige. And the book becomes a sort of, what is this, like a menage a trois, in the sense that she and Silver write lots of these heated letters to Dick about their feelings.
That they may or may not be sending to him,
They
actually,
may or may
at
not.
first.
Some of them they do send,
Yeah.
and it's a very book of its time, so there's a lot of facts involved.
Yeah.
And
She's sort of obsessed with him.
she's obsessed with him, but it's sort of like, as the book sort of goes on, you understand that it's not even just the sort of sexual infatuation, but something about Dick is allowing her to become unstuck, and she's writing again, and she's becoming creative again. And so I read this book originally, I think when it had its first sort of renaissance about, it's like 7 years ago, people started talking about it again and rediscovering it, a certain kind of young, and I think white feminists. For some reason, I just feel like race is important when talking about this book and the kinds of women that have embraced it and why. And so I read it and I was like, okay, this is interesting. I didn't love it. I was frankly quite irritated by it in certain ways. And when I heard you were reading it, I'd always wanted to return to it. And I mean, it's also interesting I think we talked about this on the podcast a little bit, to return to books that you've read, when you're slightly older, and what you make of it coming at it from a different stance. And I think what I really like about the book now that I completely missed is how much it's just a book about aging, and it's a book about being in a marriage for a really long time and looking for something to sort of wake you up. It's a book about not being a success and being surrounded by people who are successful, and sort of like that sort of feeling of artistic humiliation and artistic shame is really well done. I mean, I can't wait to hear what you think about it, but I think for me, if I should sum up my feelings, this is a book that reading it gives me sort of flickers of pleasure. intermittent pleasure, but talking about it is endlessly fascinating to me. And I'm so happy it's in the world, and I love thinking about it.
So it's a book that you admire but don't love.
Oh, see? But the thing about Krauss is that she's so canny. So I'm reading this and I'm feeling like, this is such a clever observation I'm having. And then you get to a point in the book where Krauss says that a woman comes up to her at a party and he's just like, Chris, I hate your work, but I love talking about it. So she herself is so self-reflective and interesting.
Yeah, I can see
so
that.
What are you making?
There's also something about this. There's a lot of pretension in the book, and it's hard to tell whether or not it's how much of it is sort of self-reflective and how much of it is naive.
I don't think any of it is naive reading it this time around. I thought so much of it was, but I think she's...
Right, and I think that's a problem. I mean, I will say that after 50 pages, I now feel kind of into the flow of this, and I'll definitely finish it and talk about it more next week. But I would as soon watch a TV show about these people as I would put my hand on a hot stove. I mean, it's like you can get away with some of this in print, but even Jill Soloway, very talented person, but I don't understand how you could possibly bring these people to life without them being just completely insufferable.
Right.
But maybe I'll get into that more next week. I mean, there's a lot of this. They each wrote a second letter. Silver about jealousy, Chris about the Ramones, and the Kierkegaardian third remove.
I'll write you letters.
Yeah. But I'll have a more fully formed opinion next week. So more Chris Krauss.
I can't wait.
Guys.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, John.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.